me to be able to introduce my esteemed colleague, Raugi Assaad. Raugi and I go back a very long way. I just looked up this morning when the Arab Spring was. And, you know, in some ways it seems like a short period of time, and in other ways, so much has happened, so much has changed in the period since, and it seems almost another world. Over the years, Professor Assaad has talked to this group about a couple of different topics. It's gone back and forth. One is social, political, and economic developments in the Middle East. A couple of times, several. The other is closer to his research, which deals with labor markets and education in, not just in Egypt, but in the Middle East more broadly. Many of you know that Professor Assaad has established a reputation as an authority on this subject, and he doesn't just do it from 50,000 feet. Many of you know he has an enormous network that he's built up over the years to facilitate high-quality data gathering and processing, not just in one country, but in a number of countries. And some of these researchers are known to me, and they're, you know, extremely impressive people. I think that from the blurb that Ragui gave me, he's going to be talking both about the context in which the current challenges are being faced, and also how they're being faced. I should ask him before he begins if he'd like to be interrupted with questions, would you? Absolutely. And then we'll also have time at the end of his talk for more questions. So Professor Assaad will speak on youth employment challenges in the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you all for coming. I want to keep this very informal. It's a small group, and so let's have the conversation flow naturally. So please do interrupt with questions and even comments. So I'm going to give you, to start with, a few what economists call stylized facts, kind of what some big picture issues regarding employment and unemployment in this region look like. And then I'm going to provide you with a sort of argument of what I think is happening to produce these stylized facts. So what sort of changes are occurring that result in the stylized facts that we see. And in particular, I'm going to end with presenting some of our recent research with Colette is sitting here, a paper that we've done recently on school-to-work transitions of young people in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, kind of looking at the changes that are occurring in the school-to-work transition across cohorts, across men and women, across the three countries, and by education level. So a lot of moving parts. And then we'll conclude with some concluding remarks. So first, let's start with the very important stylized fact, which is that the Middle East and North Africa region really stands out in terms of youth unemployment. We are talking about unemployment rates in the Middle East side, the Arab states of the Middle East, to about 20%, in North Africa, 30%, which is nearly 3 times the world average, which is around 12%. None of the other regions, except for possibly Latin America, come even close. So youth unemployment is definitely a characteristic that is much more acute in this region than in other parts of the world. The second stylized fact is the rapid increase in educational attainment. And here I'm listing the top 20 countries in terms of the increase in the mean years of schooling over the 30 years from 1980 to 2010. This is based on a data set called Barrow and Lee, Barrow and Lee basically gathered educational attainment data for pretty much the whole world. And you're able to look at changes over time, as well as in attainment, as well as years of schooling. So you can see all the red bars are countries from the Middle East, North Africa, included Iran here because it's really part of the Middle East. It's not an Arab state, but it's part of the Middle East. So out of the 20 countries, 8 are Arab countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and the 9th is Iran. And you can see that, so education has been growing quite fast. And I'm going to show you another kind of version of that, which is the proportion that is reached secondary education, but not post-secondary, and the proportion that has reached post-secondary education. So this is secondary school only, and then this is post-secondary, and then the dashed line is males, the solid line is females. So red is secondary, blue is post-secondary, and the years on the x-axis are years of birth. So if you look at somebody born in 1950 in Algeria, let's say a woman born in 1950 in Algeria had about a 4% chance of reaching secondary and a 2% chance of reaching post-secondary. And that has increased for post-secondary to about 20% chance by the time somebody is born in mid-1980s. So a huge increase in the proportion who have achieved post-secondary education, and especially among women. And you can see that the rate among women has surpassed that among men in 3 of these countries. Not so much yet in Egypt, but they're catching up very fast. This dip is artificial because I think I just took some cohorts that may not have completed their education yet. This is data from 2010. So you can see that, especially in Tunisia and Jordan, very sharp increases in the proportion with post-secondary education among women, a little less so among men, but still quite sharp increases in post-secondary education. So we're combining, we have this issue of very high rates of unemployment and rapid increases in educational attainment. So let's look at the combination of the two. How does education correlate with unemployment in this region? And that's what this graph is all about. So I have different levels of education, from illiterate to university and above. And depending on the country, I'm looking at the unemployment rate. This is overall unemployment rate, not just youth, across education. And you can see for men in Egypt, at least in 2012, there is a clear increase in unemployment across education levels. That is not always the case, but there is in Tunisia, the highest unemployment is for the university educated. Among women, the highest unemployment in Egypt is among the secondary educated, but still very high among university, and post-secondary here is two-year degrees. But generally, you see a very strong correlation with the higher the education, the greater the unemployment. Again, this is quite specific to this region. In most parts of the world, it's the least educated who are the least able to get jobs. And so again, there is this puzzle. Why is it some of the most educated in these countries who are unemployed? And I'm going to try to kind of explain these puzzles, in a sense, by providing some of the context. But clearly, the kind of unemployment you see in this region, which is a more educated unemployment entering the labor market, kind of youth, young people who are entering the labor market for the first time being unemployed, is quite different from the kind of unemployment you would see in the US, where it might be people losing their jobs, older people, more marginalized groups, etc. So, what's the argument that I'm going to use to try and tie these things together? First, I'm going to argue that there has been, in most of these countries, a sort of post-independent social contract, which has been dubbed or called the authoritarian bargain, where the regimes, which were mostly authoritarian, made sort of deals with certain politically critical groups. And these critical groups may vary from country to country, but essentially the deal is that if you stay quiet politically and don't make a lot of noise, we'll give you good jobs in the bureaucracy. And we will provide you with stable employment and also access to subsidized services, subsidized commodities, and the regime will take care of you so long as you don't make too much political noise. Now, those critically sensitive groups or politically sensitive groups were in many North African countries the educated middle class, and so education played a big role in eligibility for these government giveaways, in particular public sector jobs. And in some countries like Jordan, for example, it combined with ethnic belonging. So if you were a Bedouin Jordanian, you had access to these government jobs. If you were Palestinian, you were less likely to have access to these government jobs. So there's certain groups that were much more crucial to the survival of the regime. In other countries, like the oil-rich countries, basically all nationals, because they're a small fraction of the population in these countries anyway. You can bring cheap workers from elsewhere, so you can give all nationals that authoritarian bargain. And essentially, so the authoritarian bargain essentially is a pact for political quiescence. Now, the problem with the authoritarian bargain is that two phenomena made it impossible for the governments to sustain these bargains. The youth bulge, which is very pronounced in this region, and that is demographic phenomenon at a certain stage in the demographic transition where the proportion of youth in the population rises very rapidly. And that most of the Middle East has already gone through that and reached its peak youth bulge somewhere in the 2015, varies from country to country, but that's kind of the average for the region. And rapid growth of education made a lot of people potentially eligible for these government jobs, and that was just not fiscally sustainable. And so the government started eroding on that commitment and to provide government jobs to mostly educated groups. And of course, some in the Gulf had the resources to continue. And in fact, after the Arab Spring, the first thing that the Gulf monarchies did was to give a whole bunch of money to their citizens to keep them quiet, and as part of the authoritarian bargain. So I'm not talking so much about the oil-rich Gulf countries, but more about the populous countries of North Africa and some in the Middle East like Jordan. Now, so as a result of this inability to keep up with the number of young people, there was also quite a bit of economic restructuring that occurred starting in the 1980s, but going through the 1990s, which essentially meant that you had to retrench the public sector. But the result of the economic restructuring, is the theory behind the economic restructuring, was that the private sector was going to emerge and provide the good jobs. And in fact, that didn't materialize much. What happened is that the private sector did not grow very fast, and the formal private sector, at least the part that provides the good jobs in the private sector, did not grow as expected, and you had essentially a shortage of good jobs in the economy. And whatever good jobs were available, I'm going to show you that at least in two cases, in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, they were increasingly allocated on the basis of social class. So that if you were from a higher social class, you were selected into these good jobs, and that's the rationing mechanism for rationing these scarce, good private sector jobs. That's not, the public sector did not discriminate. If you got the education degree, you essentially got the public sector job, irrespective of your social class background. whereas the private sector increasingly discriminated by social class. And so we'll bring in that dimension in a moment. So basically we have very rapidly rising education, high expectations for good jobs. People expect at least to have to join formal jobs, and as a result of these formal jobs to make modern transitions into the middle class in some sense. But with the poor job outcomes, you essentially have people who are saying, I'm going to wait a little longer to see if I can get a good job, and search longer and basically queue for those very scarce public sector jobs. And that is what, in my view, explains the very high unemployment rates. So the high unemployment here is not the complete absence of any job. It is the absence of jobs that meet the expectations of the educated young people, and therefore they're willing to search longer and wait longer. Now that phenomenon of waiting for things to kind of come together has been dubbed in the literature on the region wait adulthood, and for short they called it waithood. So waithood is the kind of young people kind of saying, okay, we can postpone transitions to adulthood for a while, let's just wait until things fall together, and then maybe once we get a good job we'll be able to get married and start families, etc. And there's actually a book called Generations in Waiting, which kind of describes this idea. So you get a lot of young people who are neither in school, nor in employment, nor in training. There's a term for that, it's called NEET, N-E-E-T. And that becomes fairly common both among men and women.
So this is true, Ragui, that it isn't that they're doing part-time jobs, they're just not doing any remunerative work at all, is that it?
No remunerative work, they're continuing to, they're not able to form families, so they're still living with their parents. And so part of the way they sustain themselves is by continuing to live with their parents and kind of delaying marriage quite substantially. But, so anyway, we'll look at that, but, so this is a chart where I try to kind of show this erosion of the social contract. And what I do here is I look at the first job that people get in the labor market, the first job they obtain, based on when they enter the labor market. And I'm looking at people who have secondary degrees and above, so these are relatively educated people. And if you had a secondary degree or above, and you were living in Tunisia or Egypt, you pretty much had a nearly 80% chance of getting a public sector job if you entered the labor market in 1975. Right? So if you got the degree, secondary or above, you were very highly likely to get a public sector job if you were entering in 1975. And a little less so in Jordan, about 60%, and Algeria. In fact, Jordan and Algeria continued growing for a while. Algeria peaked, in fact, in the mid-80s after oil prices declined. And then after that, they mostly reduced the proportion of young people who have secondary degrees who are able to get these first jobs in the public sector. So in Egypt, it's gone from nearly 75% to about 20% or 25% or so. But in most other countries it did that. The timing of the erosion of that kind of promise of a public sector job varies. So in Tunisia, interestingly, only quite recently is the decline that you see in the proportion getting these public sector jobs. And Algeria declined for a while, but then oil prices stabilized and they could continue hiring into the public sector.
Raugi, for this figure, do you restrict by a certain number of years after finishing school, or is it just first job even if it's 10 years after?
Yeah, it's first job whenever that first job comes. Right?
Yeah, so some of these people on this right hand might also be queuing for years before they enter.
That's right. I mean, we don't know when they got their first job. Well, they got their first job in that year, but we don't know how much after they left school.
Yeah.
So this is kind of after waiting. So those, it's among the employed. Later on, we'll look at non-employment as one of the potential outcomes. So, All right, so then let's look at what's happening to the other forms of employment for these people. So this is the proportion that is getting formal private employment, formal private wage employment. And you saw the big decline in those getting formal public employment. For instance, in countries like Egypt and Algeria, there is a very small increase in the proportion getting formal private employment. So the group that didn't get the public sector jobs are not getting formal private sector jobs. A bit more in Tunisia and Jordan, where it's gone from 20 to about 30 or 40% or so in the case of Jordan. In the case of Tunisia, so Tunisia and Jordan have managed to provide formal private employment a bit more than the case of Algeria and Egypt. And as we saw, Algeria didn't have as much of an erosion in public sector employment as Egypt did. Now, so what's happening then? What's happening is I'm showing here informal private wage employment. There is a fourth category, which is self-employment or family employment, family-based employment, which I'm not showing here, but that doesn't show a very strong trend. But clearly, in the case of Egypt at least, you see huge increase in this informality of employment. And the same thing in Jordan, big increase, and in Algeria. Now, so the idea is the quality of the jobs people are getting with the same level of education has eroded quite considerably over time, and they are increasingly now faced with this informality. Now, if you're faced with informal jobs, you might say, well, I'm going to wait a little longer. I'm going to wait it out, and maybe I'll be lucky and get one of those formal jobs. Now, there is a very early model in development economics which predicts exactly that kind of behavior. When the labor market is dualistic, where you have a modern sector and a traditional sector, and people have a probability of getting into the modern sector that is not zero, they will essentially queue for those modern sector jobs. It's called the Harris-Todaro model. So if you studied development economics in 1970, you would have studied the Harris-Todaro model, and it predicts unemployment. This is a very similar situation here. And instead of the urban-rural, which Todaro focused on, it's formal versus informal labor markets. So I, in fact, explained the high unemployment rates by this kind of segmentation of the labor market and the willingness of people to queue for, educated young people to queue for those educated jobs. Okay, so the question is, we have this transition from school to work, and that is changing over time because the probability of getting public sector job is declining. The probability of getting private sector job varies between countries. And the question is, how does it relate to socioeconomic status as well as education? So I'm going to now have a lot of moving parts. I'm going to look at three cohorts. A cohort that graduated from school in the 1980s, approximately. It varies a little bit from country to country. A cohort that graduated from school in the 1990s, I'll call that the middle cohort, and a cohort that graduated from school in the 2000s. And these are from three comparable surveys that have longitudinal information, so that the surveys that Bob mentioned at the beginning, where we ask people not only about their current labor market situation, but about their entire trajectory. And in particular, we asked them about what was their first job and when they got their first job, irrespective of how old they are now. So, so we're looking here at the people who graduated and how did they fare in the labor market as they went from these three different cohorts. But in all cases, we're looking at their first job. So the first job for these people happened in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000. So you can look at cohorts as a way of looking at structural change in the economy. Now, we're also dividing by male-female, because we know that the trajectories for male-female are very different. We're looking at three separate countries, and we're going to look at them by different levels of education and socioeconomic background. So a lot of moving parts. 3 cohorts, 4 levels of education, 2 genders, 3 countries. A lot of stuff to follow. But the education, we essentially look at low education are people who have less than secondary. Now, that's almost true. Secondary here is upper secondary, so they didn't get an upper secondary degree. In the case of Tunisia, we had to reduce that low education to less than lower secondary, which is kind of 9th grade, because the increase in education in Tunisia is quite recent. And when you went back to the old cohort, if you got a secondary degree, you were actually pre-educated. So we changed those thresholds a little bit in the case of Tunisia to be able to look at that old cohort. Now, intermediate education is a secondary degree, like an upper secondary degree, high school. And then we didn't think it was very worthwhile to separate these by socioeconomic class, because they're mostly, if you only receive those 2 levels of education, you're generally of low SES or low socioeconomic status. Among those who got a higher education, we divided them into low SES and high SES by looking at the education of their parents and the occupation of the father. Most mothers didn't work, so the occupation of the father. And we were able to kind of break that group into a low SES and a high SES so that we can look at the effect of social class. What happens when you get a higher education but you're of a low social class compared to a high social class. So let's look at a little bit, one more picture on unemployment. I know this is complicated, but I'll have to just go through it. And then we'll go to these transitions from school to work. So this is trying to see how long do people remain unemployed. So the first column here is what is the proportion of people who are unemployed for at least 7 days. That's the standard definition of unemployment, meaning they're searching for work and they're not working, desiring to work and searching for work for at least 7 days. The next one is the people who have been unemployed for at least 6 months. And then at least 1 year, at least 2 years. And among those, I'm showing those who never worked before, which is the dark, and those who have some previous work experience. So in the case of Egypt, you see that unemployment rates for men are pretty low, right? I mean, we're talking about 5% total, and by the time we get those who are unemployed for 2+ years, we're talking about 2%. And so one thing we will notice in the case of Egypt is that men don't remain in unemployment very long and are not always likely to be unemployed. And even though unemployment increases with education, generally unemployment rates among men are low. But if you look at unemployment rates among women in Egypt, it's a completely different picture. Now, if you ask me, okay, and you can see that the vast majority of them have never worked before and are unemployed for very long periods of time. So, why do you think there's such a big difference between men and women? Those of you who kind of know something about it. I mean, these are dramatically higher unemployment rates. We're talking about 5 times higher or something like that.
Social structure.
That's not enough as an explanation.
Maybe they are less educated than men.
Nope, they're actually now about the same. And in fact, unemployment increases with education, doesn't decrease with education. Basically, it has to do with expectation about what sort of job is appropriate. So men are, in Egypt, as you saw, very likely to be in informal jobs, right? A huge percent end up in informal employment. And for those, you don't have to be unemployed for very long. Informal employment is fairly easy to get into and to find a job. You're queuing for the formal jobs. But the informal jobs, that's a common state, and those are fairly quick. But women, it's not acceptable for them to take these informal jobs. right? Informal jobs are going to threaten what is considered to be their primary role, is to be a housewife and to be married, and the reputational effect of getting informal employment might threaten your marriageability. And so women have a much higher reservation, I don't call it reservation wage, I call it reservation working conditions. Right? The minimum working conditions necessary for women to accept a job is actually quite a bit higher than the case of men, and that's what they're waiting for, government jobs. So all these people, either give me a government job or sorry, I'm not able to work. And because they're essentially looking for the main model there is a male breadwinner and a female homemaker. Now, in the case of Jordan and Tunisia, you have a lot more of this waiting behavior among men as well. And we saw that in the case of Jordan and Tunisia, the proportion of jobs that were formal in the private sector is much higher. And therefore, it is worth waiting for. If you believe the Harris-Todaro model, the greater the probability of getting a formal job, the more there is unemployment, not the less. Because you have a greater expectation of getting this formal job, it's more worthwhile to queue for them. So in the case of Jordan and Tunisia, the unemployment is higher among men as well, but still quite high among women, very similar to the case of Egypt in the case of women. And unemployment is also very high for this very long-term unemployment in Tunisia. It's 4% of men and 13% in the case of Tunisia. So if we adopt this waithood term, waithood is a more likely state in the case of Jordan and Tunisia among men, and it's definitely a state among all three countries when it comes to women. Okay, so what are the outcomes of the school-to-work transition we're going to look at? And here, the outcomes are, we're going to look at what is their status 3 years after leaving school. So we're going to give them 3 years to find their first job. If they haven't found their first job after 3 years, we're going to say that they have not yet worked. So that we're looking at the same stage in the school-to-work transition for all three cohorts, the old, the middle, and the young. And for men, we're going to look at the probability of getting a public sector job, the probability of getting a formal private sector job, an informal private wage employment, or to work for a family business and be self-employed. And then finally, if they haven't gotten any of these within 3 years, they have not yet worked. So they have not completed the transition to employment. So that's the point that Colette was asking about, how long we wait 3 years here too. And for women, because the samples are smaller and a much smaller proportion of them work, we're just going to look at public sector, private sector, which includes all of these, and not yet worked. We're not going to distinguish so much because of the sample size. All right, so those are the outcomes we're looking at, and then the waithood phenomenon is essentially going to be looking at the proportion that has not yet worked and whether that proportion has increased over cohorts over time, or over cohorts is our measure of time. All right, so let's look at the first set of graphs, and I apologize, these are a bit complicated, but this graph is looking at the predicted probability of joining the public sector within 3 years of exiting school. And you have the three countries. This is just males for now. So sorry if I should have marked only males. This is just for males, and you have the three cohorts, oldest, middle, youngest. And you have the educational and socioeconomic class taxonomy, and the three countries. So this is not directly measured, this is modeled. So we do a model, a multinomial logit model, and we estimate control for a bunch of things, and then estimate these probabilities so that we're comparing similar people to each other. So these are people who are similar education and similar age group in each one of these dots. Now, what you can see, if you have low education, you have no probability of getting a public sector job anyway. Even an intermediate education, you have fairly low probability, but the important thing is that it's declining. The youngest is the square, and you have a big decline in the probability of getting a public sector job. Now, it's interesting that the people who are most reliant on public sector jobs are the higher education but low socioeconomic status. They're the ones who are most likely to get public sector jobs. These guys are not as likely to get public sector jobs because they find work in the private sector, thank you very much. Good jobs in the private sector, if you have a high. But even among the high socioeconomic status, you have a bit of a decline in the probability of getting public sector. So in Egypt, the story is very clear. Probability of getting public sector job is declining dramatically for those with higher levels of education, and especially if you're of low SES, you are more dependent on it and it's affecting you more. The case of Jordan, it's a mixed story, and it's a story where the probability initially went down for all groups. So you see the middle group is always the lowest in terms of, at least for those three groups here, and then recovered again. And that's interesting because you see that in the data for Jordan, is that in the last decade or so, the Jordanian government is now starting to hire graduates again within the public sector. And in particular, the probability of joining the public sector in Jordan is non-negligible, even among those with lower education. So what's happening here is that, as I said, in Jordan, it's not so much the educated as those who have a Bedouin background. And the public sector in Jordan is defined to include the military and the police. And so these are all the people who are recruited in the security forces from Bedouin backgrounds, and you can see them at lower levels of education as well as the low socioeconomic status. Now in Tunisia, you have a very similar story as in Egypt. You have a decline in the probability of employment in the public sector, although there was not as high a probability among the higher education, low socioeconomic status as there was for Egypt, but you do see a big decline among that group that has acquired higher education with low SES. All right, so you, and then, okay, so that's as far as getting the chance of getting a public sector job. Let me look at the chance of getting a formal private sector job. So these are the good jobs in the private sector. Again, if you have low education, practically zero chance of getting those. But as your education increases, your probability rises. And then if you're higher education and you are of high SES, you have a much higher probability. So in the case, the probability hasn't changed that much across cohorts, but is clearly very socioeconomic status dependent. You pretty much have to come from an educated parental background to get those jobs, at least in the case of Egypt. Less so in the case of Jordan. In Jordan, they managed to give access to formal private sector jobs to basically anybody who has higher education, and you can see that those probabilities are rising quite substantially over time. So Jordan at least has managed to provide a more equitable access to private sector jobs than Egypt. And in Tunisia, you can see here that the big decline in the probability of private sector employment for the low socioeconomic status, not as much of a decline for the high socioeconomic status. So Tunisia and Egypt are quite similar in terms of that good private sector jobs are dependent on socioeconomic status. Now let me move on. This is informal private sector work, wage work. And I said you saw in the earlier graph that Egypt pretty much had a big increase in that, and that's confirmed here. As of course, the low education have always relied on this kind of work, right? 60–70% get informal private sector work. The remaining category for them is the self-employment and family business, which I'm not showing here. But you can see here that across cohorts, there's been an increase in the probability of informal. So now, if you have a higher education, you basically have a much higher chance of getting an informal job over time. If you have a high SES, though, you don't have to rely on informal jobs that much, and it hasn't changed over time. Jordan, very low probabilities of informal. Why is that? Anybody know anything about the way the Jordanian labor market works? Who takes the poor jobs in Jordan? You can't talk.
I can't tell.
But Mu'izz can.
Refugees, probably.
Actually, not so much. Egyptian migrant workers, right?
Yeah,
So it's the Egyptians coming from Egypt to take those informal jobs in Jordan. Now increasingly Syrian refugees, but that's recent. But it's traditionally been the informal economy in Jordan is the purview of migrant workers. Jordan is a labor receiving country. Low-skilled labor goes to Jordan from lower wage countries, and then labor sending among higher educated and high-skilled labor. But the Jordanians simply try to avoid informal employment, and you can see that hasn't changed. Whereas in Tunisia, it's also mostly the less educated who are relying on informal employment, and the more educated try to avoid that. So where are these more educated Jordanians who are not getting public, Jordanians and Syrians, who are not getting public sector jobs, who are not getting as much formal private sector jobs, where do they end up? How come only in Egypt has informality increased so much? So what do you think is the answer? Where did they end up?
Immigration.
Nope. Some of them do, but
Yeah, that's not significant.
I mean, I guess when they immigrate, they drop out of our sample, so we don't really know. But how about that last state, which we called waithood, right? So there is this not yet worked, right, after 3 years. And you can see that that not yet worked is very low in Egypt after 3 years. Most of the men have gotten jobs within 3 years, but a very high proportion of the Tunisians and a high proportion of the Jordanians have not yet worked after 3 years. So, and that has increased quite a bit across cohorts. So that waithood phenomenon is very pronounced. These are very long-term non-employed. They may be unemployed, they may be not even looking. But that's the need, so-called need phenomenon, not unemployment, education, or training, and that's rising quite substantially, especially among the higher educated, low SES. And you can see in the case of, at least in the case of Tunisia. A bit less so in the case of Jordan, where it's actually declining here. And that's because the private formal sector is doing a little better in the Jordanian case. So that's for men. Let's look at the situation for women. Very similar to the case of men, very strongly declining probabilities of getting public sector employment. Right? So the social contract is eroding. A lot of these educated women are not likely to get public sector employment. And you can see it in the case of Egypt. You can see it in the case of Tunisia, where there is a decline, but some recovery in the case of Tunisia. And in the case of Jordan, not much change, but very low levels. Very few of these new entrants are getting any kind of employment within 3 years. Only 10% are getting public sector employment. And not much change. So that but you can see that the erosion of the social contract is definitely very strongly affecting both Egypt and Tunisia. Okay, this is the proportion. Now I skipped the proportion getting private sector work and went straight to the proportion not yet working. Look at those rates. After 3 years, 80 to 90% are not yet working. So the waithood phenomenon is enormous among women who are, and you can see that in the case of Jordan, again, more like 80% and nearly 100% not working for the low educated. But interesting in the case of Egypt is that there was a reduction in that probability, but as the cohorts go from oldest to youngest, there is an increase in the probability of not yet working within 3 years. So waithood among women is increasing in Egypt. In the other two countries, it's just high. Maybe with a small reduction in the case of the low SES. So essentially, we're seeing a situation where for women, education is not translating into good jobs, it's translating into more inactivity. And in the case of men in Egypt, it's translating into informality. In the case of Jordan and Tunisia, it's translating into waithood. And it's, just a quick summary. There is a decline in those able to make a transition to public sector employment. And as public sector opportunities decline, school-to-work transitions become more protracted and uncertain, especially in Jordan and Tunisia. You see that increasing waithood. Formal private sector jobs are strongly predicated on socioeconomic status in Egypt. Low SES Egyptian men increasingly transitioning into informal employment, and Egyptian women are simply experiencing a declining ability to obtain public sector jobs, but more likely to remain non-employed if they don't. In the case of Jordan, we see informal work becoming the purview of non-Jordanians, and there are very few self-employment opportunities for young people, and so that's why there was a lot of pressure on the government to recover, in a sense, to bring back the authoritarian bargain after the Arab Spring. So they just felt that they had to hire those young people. And that's why there is a recovery of public sector employment. And the fallback position for Jordanian males has increasingly become non-employment as opposed to informal employment. In Tunisia, there is a differential by social class, which you see in Egypt, and there is also high rates of waithood among those with low SES. So I would argue that the high unemployment rates that we're seeing are symptoms of school-to-work transition that has become much more protracted as young people dislike the options that they have. And they had an expectation that once they get an education, they will have a modern transition into a formal job. That's becoming much more difficult to achieve. And they're reacting by simply remaining out of the labor market for longer or remaining unemployed for longer. In Egypt, they seem to, at least among young men, to be increasingly willing to accept informal employment as a fallback. And that may be a sign of simply the very poor prospects in the private formal sector in Egypt. But that doesn't apply to women who would rather remain non-employed rather than take low-quality jobs that could threaten their marriageability. So I will stop here.
There's so many kinds of questions right now. I'll just sort of kick it off because you're dealing with very different economies, and Algeria was, I think, kind of in and out there.
Yeah, I don't have data, the same very detailed data on Algeria.
What I'm trying to get my mind around is what the implications are for governments making their decisions about education. Because from one standpoint, it sounds like, I started this stuff when Mike Tadaro was a pup, the educational system is, the sociologists have a way of explaining how it just imitates foreign educational systems, just produces people, whether they're jobs or not. Are there implications for government educational reform here? that you can see, or, and that's just a way of kicking off the question, what are the public policy implications?
No, I think this is great because, you know, there's a great demand for higher education, right? Despite the fact that people have poor job prospects, they really want to get into those universities, right? And so you have a situation where there's huge political demand. Seats are rationed primarily based on grades. So you have these competitive centralized systems of taking people who are scoring higher in the high school graduation exam. But there are very few private universities. Maybe Jordan is the one exception here where private universities are a bit more common, but it's mostly public education for free. So there is little cost to go to university, and there's obviously not very much income foregone from staying a little longer and going to university. And so what's happening is that the demand for education, you could say, what is fueling that demand given that there's such poor job prospects, especially if you're from a low socioeconomic status. It is primarily now the social demand, right? It's also for marriageability purposes. Education is a way to get a better spouse. So people want that degree, want that certificate. And in the past, it used to open up the way for a government job, and so that kind of remains as part of the social value of education.
Is this mainly signaling, or is it actual?
Mostly signaling. It is not, you know, the quality of education is quite poor if you measure it by performance in these standardized international exams.
But you gotta get in.
You need to get in and get that degree. So the credential is. Now, what's interesting though is that there is a change. So for instance, in Tunisia, the number, you saw those graphs and how they were just picking, the post-secondary was increasing very, very rapidly. But around 2014-15, it seems to have come to a full stop. And the curve, rather than going up, they're starting to come down. So the number of students getting into university in Tunisia has declined, actually, which is shocking after it's been growing at 13% per year for more than a decade and a half. That's 5 times the population growth. So it's like the system was on full throttle and then it falls off the cliff. Now, that hasn't happened in Jordan and Egypt, where you still have pretty high premium on people wanting to get into university. But I did another paper which is trying to show, okay, why is it then that the number of graduates from pretty theoretical, abstract fields like the humanities and the social sciences, not to say anything wrong about the social sciences, of course, is growing, in fact, faster than the number of practical fields. And I tried to look into that, and it turns out that as far as a public university is concerned, it's a lot cheaper to add a seat in the humanities and social sciences and in fields like business and commerce than it is to add a seat in engineering, or the faculty-student ratio is something like 300 to 1 versus 20 to 1. So a government that wants to respond to political pressure for more seats in universities will have a very strong incentive to add the seats in those theoretical fields. And so that's partly what's happening in the education field. Of course, these are people who have the hardest time getting employed. So you have, so there are lots of implications here, but politics is also playing a very important role. I mean, governments want to satisfy certain demands, and if people are demanding university degrees, they want to give them university degrees, irrespective of what degrees those degrees are really worth economically. But there are all kinds of calls for reform and for having people get more practical degrees. But there is in Egypt, for example, the reason you saw secondary degrees going up so much faster than university degrees is because the government deliberately channels people into the so-called vocational secondary. Vocational secondary is a terminal secondary degree, which is supposed to give you, employable skills, but you don't go on to university. But in fact, it's considered to be inferior secondary, not vocational secondary. So it has a stigma against it, and people who go into that field are the ones who eventually get stigmatized in the labor market as being those not able to get into the general secondary and the university track. So it's hard to think about, do I have solutions? Well, I think the solutions are not on the supply side, right? Are not on the rate at which you give people access to education and what sort of education you give. The solution are going to have to come from the demand side. You're going to have private sectors that are growing in an employment-intensive way and providing fairly good jobs, not say, in the private sector. And that essentially, there was a very recent opinion piece by Danny Roderick, who was really saying that this problem is not just in the Middle East, right? This idea of a dualistic labor market with a lot of very low productivity jobs and a few high productivity jobs in sectors that are connected to the world economy, in sectors that are plugged into value chains, etc., is a worldwide problem. And there is essentially a missing middle of not enough good enough jobs, right? And those are in the medium and small enterprises. And that bifurcation in the labor market is occurring in many, many places. And that you really need to grow that small and medium enterprise sector to get at least good enough jobs to absorb all these young people.
So what about, in terms of that demand side, obviously huge variation by country, but quite significant growth in tourism and hospitality. I'm not thinking about entry-level service jobs, more sort of managerial, tour guiding, some of those kind of things, as well as then the ability to be able to use technology and work from your home as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think those are two extremely promising and important sectors. You can imagine Egypt and Jordan and Tunisia, all three countries are highly tourist-oriented countries. Except tourism is an extremely volatile industry in a region that is hit by geopolitical shocks all the time, right? And so all three countries invested a great deal in tourism infrastructure, but then the Arab Spring came along and that infrastructure just remained empty. And so it's a sector that is very promising from the point of view you're talking about, but is very fragile.
When I think the case of Saudi Arabia and Vision 2030 and the massive investment that they plan to make in tourism is even...
Yeah, but I think for Saudi Arabia, by the way, is an extremely high tourism country,
right,
but it's a single type of tourism.
Right.
I'm not sure of too many people who are going to go to Saudi Arabia for purposes other than doing the pilgrimage.
Yeah. But it seems the government is banking on that.
Yeah, and it's a huge sector in Saudi Arabia. There's no question about it. But whether it generates the kinds of jobs that we're talking about, I don't know. The other sector, the ICT sector, and kind of the ability to either work from home or bring these business outsourcing and back office jobs and stuff like that. That's, again, a very promising sector, and I think that I saw some rankings for Egypt among companies, kind of consultants that do rankings for a whole bunch of countries on their ICT readiness in some sense. So Egypt ranked first in the world in terms of cost, right? Simply the economics of it ranked in the middle of the pack in terms of skills, whether the labor force is skilled enough to do this kind of work and language skills and that sort of thing. And it ranked in the bottom as far as business environment, right?
So
for these international companies.
Low cost, is that what you meant?
Yeah, I mean, it's low cost, so it's ranked it's ranked first in terms of being low cost. Yeah.
So it's the third that's the key.
It's the third that's the barrier, right? The business environment has been very poor, and international companies that do this kind of work have not been wanting to come for that. But ICT is a promising, there is some growth in it, but not quite enough, and especially not in the work at home type of settings. And at least, you know, there's, nominally speaking, a lot of educated people who can take these jobs. They may not have the best education, but I think these jobs don't require a very high education level. Go ahead.
I have though I'm not from that region, I'm not familiar with what is going on there and what is the economic base of that region, but my question particularly is that types of similar situation can happen in my country as well. I can see this visualize, when I go through your slides, I can just visualize these things happening in my country. Sure. So, what is the ratio of people going to the university for higher education and the jobs available in the public sector and the private sector? The one question to you. And the second one is like whether the people who already go to the university would like to go to the basis of, I mean like the economic basis. Do they want to go back to the agriculture or other industry area to go and work for them, or like no? Because once
you know the answer to that.
Yeah. I mean, like in my country, what I see is like once you are in the university and graduated, then you don't want to go back to the agriculture field, even if it is sophisticated or so many things. And because of that, people are getting this kind of like waithood. They are just looking for a better job but not doing anything else. Like they are just unemployed. So my question would be
that's exactly my argument. So basically, the proportion going to university is that blue line, right? The blue line has been going up quite sharply in all of these countries. Look at Jordan. I mean, 45% of young women born in 1990 have a university degree.
Yeah.
Right?
It's extraordinary, actually.
It's really huge, and in Tunisia, look at that gradient, how it increased from about 5% just one generation ago to about 35% now. So huge increases in the proportion of people getting university degrees, and as you said, your expectation for what job I get changes dramatically once you get a university degree.
Yeah.
Right? They don't no longer want what I refer to as the traditional transition to from school to work, which is essentially going to work for the family farm or the family business,
Yes.
or and working with your parents, and kind of that sort of transition is not one that somebody who acquired a university or even a high school degree is desiring anymore. And so they want modern jobs. And modern jobs means jobs in formal settings.
Yes.
And those are the jobs that are few and far between, right? Those are the scarce jobs.
Yes.
What sense do you have about the actual desire for employment versus after post-secondary education versus post-secondary education for other reasons around manageability, especially I think maybe more on the female side, potentially? I was reading something about Jordan, about looking at this topic, that women are becoming more educated, but not necessarily with the goal or purpose of employment.
Well, they wouldn't say that they're unemployed, right? I mean, there's another,
Sure.
which is, I'm not looking for work, I'm out of the labor force. They wouldn't show up here.
Right.
So the fact that very high rates, you know, this is 40% of all women who have secondary degrees are saying, I'm actively seeking work. So they do want jobs, but those jobs that they want have to meet certain minimum conditions. So if you tell them, I'm offering you a public sector job, they will take it on the spot, and they will remain in it all the way till retirement. If you offer them formal or informal private sector job, they may take it, at least formal, they will take it, but they will probably quit at marriage because it's not compatible with their, the hours and and especially informal private sector jobs are definitely not compatible compatible with their marital responsibilities. So that we see that we have graphs that show you whether you quit your job at marriage for women or not depends on which job, what kind of job you have, right? And it's the public sector ones, they will not quit. Okay.
So there is an important takeaway from this presentation is about, distinguishing between high educated and they are low SES and high SAS,
Yes,
which is an
absolutely.
important
Absolutely.
an important criteria to diversify or to distinguish between in employment rates, and to explain it. But regarding Egyptian case and less for Tunisia, we see that unemployment rates are the lowest among males because they are more willing to go to informal jobs,
That's right.
which is, can we say that has some other aspects, because getting a job in employment in the informal sector regarding the quality of life, the economic development in general. So this is an important, so can we say that in Egypt, especially that males don't want to get high educated because they know previously that this criteria of being high SES is more it's an important criteria to get a job
In the private sector.
In the private sector. Yeah, so can we say that can explain this? So because they have this idea to get a good job in the private or even in the public sector because there are other considerations which are being high from high CS
High SES.
status. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, if I did a chart like this for males in Egypt, and rather than put education here, I put wealth quintile, your family wealth, unemployment goes up. So the richer you are, the more likely you are to be unemployed. Now, this is very unusual,
Yeah.
right? Very unusual. So that just shows you that the richer you are, the more likely you are going to be queuing for those good jobs and willing to wait for them. Whereas the poorer you are, even if you fix education, even if you control for education, the poorer you are, the more likely you have to fall back on your informal option. And so in Egypt, the fallback is no longer unemployment, it's informality, and unemployment is a luxury in some sense, among males. We don't see the same relationship among females because everybody has high unemployment, at least,
Sure.
yeah.
So what do I spend my waithood doing? Using social media to get increasingly frustrated and show my dissent at the current reality and lead towards the likelihood of an Arab Spring too?
Yeah. In fact, we don't have enough information about this because our surveys were so focused on knowing what they do in employment.
Yeah.
But in fact, in my next research project in Jordan is going to be one looking at that NEET group and what is it that they're doing. In fact, we're talking to UNICEF, and UNICEF is extremely interested in knowing what are these young people doing. So maybe you have answers, you young people from Arab countries.
In Nigeria, what's happening besides social media, and of course, if you're not working, but you come from a higher socioeconomic group, you have access to social media. So not everyone does, right? So access
Actually,
to
most
internet is
people
really
have
expensive.
access now.
But you still, for us, you still have to buy the data, the credit. So if you pay for it, so it's expensive, and if you're not working and your family doesn't have the means, it's really hard.
But if
to
you
access.
looking at percentages of young people who tell you they're using the internet on a regular basis are quite high.
Yeah. And so what's happening in Nigeria, just based on my observation, is a lot of young people are hanging out in the corner of bars, or we have a high number of drug use. So that's what we're seeing. So the waithood, or those that are still waiting, find other ways to kill the time, and it's really not positive. And another development is some of them are also engaging in, they're being recruited, depending on, again, socioeconomics. So if you're in a rural community and you're frustrated, there's no work, there's a lot happening in terms of conflict. So for us, recently, it's pastoralists and farmers.
Yeah.
So we've noticed that a lot of young people are being recruited and they're fighting and they're engaging in things that are not productive. But again, it also depends on your family. So if you have money, you're removed from those, you're not in a rural community, but if you are in a rural community, while you're waiting, you're already frustrated. So you're kind of ready for a fight anyway. So it's really interesting. So I'm also looking at that. I'm actually traveling to Nigeria next month, and one of the projects I'll be engaging in is youth empowerment with a nonprofit organization. And we've had this rise of young people. A lot have lost their lives because they're engaging in some of these behaviors, but also fighting.
Yeah, underemployed young people are one of the biggest risk factors for civil
Security.
conflict. So, but I want to hear from you guys. What do you think these young people are doing who are in the need state?
Well, one thing I know from Bahrain that so for women, their unemployment is fairly high compared to men, and a lot of springboarding off of this social media aspect, a lot of them started off their own businesses, Instagram businesses, for example. They started making things at home and selling. That's a very informal way of doing it, and it was a productive way of using.
By definition,
you have a kitchen at home. You start
Yeah.
like a lot of them were just baking cakes and things and posting them on Instagram. So that was a big trend in Bahrain. It just popped up all of a sudden. All of these ways to try and be productive informally came up. That's all good. I noticed.
Great.
We have time for one last one.
Well, I feel like especially in Nepal, what we've noticed now is this was a complete from people of a higher socioeconomic status who are employing people informally as drivers or whatever else, that those young people around our age are not showing up to work or are always late or whatever. And the reason that they're in this informal sector in Nepal at least is so that they can migrate to Korea, to India, to Qatar, and that's the only reason that they're even there in the first place and not doing great work. And the concern was, okay, if they're doing that here, then how are they actually going to go off into another country and have the ability to do the work that they need to do, even if it is just as a driver, so they can get greater income. And it's almost just this waiting period of, I'm going to migrate out of this
Waiting for
country.
migration. I mean, you see that very often in countries like Egypt and Jordan. Jordan, although they receive a lot of migrants, they also send a lot of migrants to the Gulf, and a lot of young people are just, young men in particular, are waiting for those migration opportunities. So I think
Well, thank you very much, Ragui. This was great.